Gonna give you 9 good tips. You might be surprised at what you learn, starting from the ground up, from the feet. If you don't have a good base, you're setting yourself up for failure. Much like any sort of building, the base isn't right, the rest of the building is gonna suffer. So we're gonna look at the feet, we're gonna look at the knees, we're gonna look at the hips, the back, the shoulders, the arm position, bar position, head position, breathing, and depth. I think that's 9, might not be, but sue me. Right, so our feet, what do we do with our feet? So it's not hugely important the stance that we hold. Everybody's hips are made differently. One of the main things that dictates the comfort of your stance is the ball and socket joint in your hip. So if you're more comfortable holding a wider stance, then hold a wider stance. But a couple of things to bear in mind, and you might want to vary your stances for these reasons. If you're gonna hold a wider stance and turn your feet out slightly more, it's gonna target more your groin, your adductor muscles, a bit more on your glutes. Whereas if you're gonna hold a narrower stance, it's gonna be less on your adductors in here. Still a lot on your glutes, but not as much. And then it's gonna work your quads a lot more if you're in this more narrow stance here, okay? Now, if we're talking about the actual position of your foot, you want to try and maintain these 3 points of contact, 1, 2, 3. And one of the other things that I should address quickly is shoes. I'm all for bare feet, but in the case of squats, the fact of the matter is that most people don't have enough mobility in their ankles and their hips to not wear shoes. And if you go barefoot, you haven't got as much of a heel raise, which I'll go through later, which gives you the chance to squat well and put your body in a good position. So unless you've got really good mobility in your ankles and hips, wear shoes. So next of all, knee positioning. What should I do with my knees? So when you're squatting down, try to keep your knees in line with your second or third toe, meaning that you're slightly pushing out your knees. And the reason for this is that it gives you more glute activation and also helps to keep your lumbar spine in a safer position so that it's not flexing over like this. If you want more details on that, just leave a comment down below and I will get back to you. So another part of the squat with respect to the knees is the knees coming over the toes. People always wonder, should I put my knees over my toes? Yes, you should put your knees over your toes, but they shouldn't pass your toes until you're approaching the parallel position. So if I'm squatting down, my knees should be starting to come over my toes around this point and let them keep translating forward at that point. There's not actually any research or solid research saying that knees over toes is going to be bad for your knees, much less squatting to this depth. So squat to this depth if you have the mobility. Again, like I was saying, you need the ankle mobility, the hip mobility. But a pro tip that I will give you is using a book about a half an inch or an inch thick, pop it under your heels, or even a pair of little weights. Pop it under your heels. That's going to make up for your heels rising up off the ground, and it's going to allow you to squat into a much better position and come back up and down without compromising anything. And that, guys, I would recommend. So guys, the third point that we're going to go over is the angle of your hip flexion. So this is basically what people see as their back bending forward and sitting back into this position. All the movement is actually coming from this joint though, okay? So as a general rule, I would say try to have it between 20 and 45 degrees of hip flexion in this position. If you can sit up a bit more, all the better. You're going to get a bit more co-activation between your quads and glutes. But if not, it's not the end of the world. You can actually squat into this position as long as you keep your back quite straight. We're just going to work our back a little bit more. Not ideal, you might as well be doing a deadlift, but for the time being, while you work on your mobility, it might be the thing for you. Ideally, you want to work into getting your back more upright, but not at the expense of flexing your lower back like this. So try to keep your back more straight, push your knees out, and let your knees come over your toes when you get this low. But that is quite difficult to do, so I wouldn't worry if you can't do that just yet. Now, saying all that, if you do get some minor flexion in your lumbar spine, it's not the end of the world. Just try to avoid it, especially if you have back pain. Now, an amazing tip for maintaining a good back position in this regard is to get some sort of a broomstick or a dial. Try to keep 3 points of contact between your head, your shoulder blades, and your back. You can just hold it in between your back, squat down, and if you lose any of those points of contact as you're squatting down, you know that you're going out of shape. So try to correct it. So next we're going to talk about your arm position. If you're using a bar of some sort, try to have your hands quite close to your shoulders with your elbows down. Pull your shoulder blades back and down, and what that hand and shoulder positioning is going to do is going to give you more back stability, especially through the use of these big lat muscles. It's going to apply more tension and stability throughout the back. If you're not using a bar, one of the things that can help is having your hands forward, and that's going to help counterbalance you if you do have some problems with mobility. So you'll find if you try and squat with your hands on your hips or your hands close to you, you're going to want to bend your back a bit more and come up onto your toes slightly. Whereas if you have your hands forward, that might help a little bit with that problem. Right, so next let's talk about bar position. Generally try to have it resting just below that bone that sticks out of your neck here. That would be classed as more of a high bar squat. If you're a bit more advanced, you can work on having a low bar squat, so having the bar more towards the bottom of your shoulder blades, really just holding it in place, leaning forward slightly, and that's going to put less pressure on your back, but that's more to get the most out of your squat, so there's less leverage coming through the top of your back, and you'll actually be able to lift a little bit more in that regard. But I would avoid it for the most part unless you're getting quite serious about trying to lift really heavy, going into competition, things like that. Right, so next we'll talk about the position of our head. So a lot of people are told to stick their head up into the air, and that's not the best idea, and I'll tell you why. So when we bend our head backwards excessively or forwards excessively, it's going to have a knock-on effect throughout our thoracic spine, which is our mid-back, and our lumbar spine, our lower back. So what we really want to do is just tuck the chin slightly inwards, just keep your neck in a completely neutral position and squat down. Don't bring it up, don't bring it down. Now, if you're going for a really big lift or you're struggling in a set, naturally you're going to put your head back because it allows you to lift more. So if you really have to and you're going for a really big lift, put the head up. It's going to help with your numbers, which is a good thing in a lot of regards. So we have to weigh up the pros and cons. So the next point is depth. I actually touched on that earlier, so I don't really need to go into it much now. But like I was saying earlier, there's not really any evidence that going deep is bad for your knees unless you have crappy technique. So like I was saying earlier, those 3 points on your feet, try to keep the weight distribution of those evenly distributed across the ground. Make sure that your heels aren't coming off the ground. And to help with that, you can use a book or two little books or two little weights about an inch high. And make sure that you're able to keep your spine in a neutral position for the most part, and that you're just bending through this hip joint. So the last point that we're going to go over is breathing, and this is a lot more important than you think. If you're coming towards the end of your set and you're really starting to struggle, if you're going for a 1 rep max especially, what you need to do with your breathing is this. So you need to take a deep breath in, fill up your lungs, fill up your belly. So this is what that looks like. You have the bar on your back, take a nice breath in, hold your breath, squeeze into position, drop down, perform the lift, back up, and only then when you get back up to the top can you breathe again. When you're lifting this heavy, your aerobic system is not needed, meaning that we don't need oxygen to perform a lift. So forget about breathing if you're going for a heavy lift. In this case, you need all the air inside your lungs, puffing out your insides, applying a lot more stability to your spine, and you're going to be able to lift a lot more safely if you're doing this. Whew! I do bring a new video out consistently every Monday. So until then, goodbye and good luck.